Oh, good morning. Yeah.
You're going to use this too, I guess, right?
I suspect this one's going to fill up.
That's okay.
It's a big topic.
Yes. Trying to make sure there's something worthy of saying.
That's right. Good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. This is a spotlight discussion, and the session number is F111. A spotlight's titled Looking Inward, Improving Our Program Self-Assessment Process. Just a few housekeeping items. Cell phone or an iPad, please turn that on silent mode. Also, please remember to evaluate the session at the end. There are the yellow paper forms on every row, or you can do it on your app as well. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers to introduce themselves and get started.
Thank you, April. And my name is Matthew McQuillan. I'm the Associate Program Director from the Rutgers University Physician Assistant Program.
My name is Ryan White. I'm the Assistant Director for Clinical Education at the Rutgers University PA program.
For those of you that may have been around for a while, I just thought it would be important to take a moment to talk about the fact that we're Rutgers again, for those of us who knew us as Rutgers University through the 90s, and then the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey through July of last year. Now we're Rutgers again. The program has been the same. It's sort of our sponsorship. The biggest thing that occurred was in July of 2013, through the New Jersey Higher Ed Restructuring Act, both Rutgers and UMDNJ were merged into one institution. So I don't think there's a possibility we'll become UMDNJ again, but you never know what can happen in the future. So it's been an experience to go through that merger, but you know, we always need extra challenges to face in our programs, right?
That's right.
Why are we here to talk about this? For me, I was talking to Ryan and reflecting on an opportunity that I had along with my program director, Jill Reichman, to attend a session a couple of years ago by some colleagues who were sharing their own experience with revision of their assessment process. And which was very good. And although we didn't walk away doing what they did, it started us thinking about how do we make our process better. And so sort of that's what one of the key things or objectives that we hope to get across or share with you this morning. By show of hands, how many of you are interested in improving your self-assessment process? Okay. Yeah, the camera's on, by the way. So, how many of you do not have a self-assessment process? Wow,
Right.
I figured. So this does pertain to everyone. So again, thanks for coming. We have a number of educational goals here, again, to share with you our experience, and that's really what this is, to take you on a journey through our process. We don't claim to be experts in self-assessment, but we are experts in our own self-assessment process. And so if there's things that we can share with you that are helpful to you as you look at yours, then that's meeting our goal. Again, it's not best practices. We're not claiming to be the sages on the stage, but again, hopefully what we have will help you. And we sort of do our best to bridge both the theoretical and the practical, because I think that's important in self-assessment, that you're thinking sort of on a theoretical level, and then how you can apply some of that theory into your own programs.
And we hope that as we tell our story, that you may be able to relate to some of the challenges we faced or some of the approaches that we took and perhaps utilize that back in your own programs.
We've tried to coordinate this so we're not bouncing back and forth, giving you whiplash, but we like to be more conversant in our style here. So we found this illustration or cartoon, and we thought it does really emphasize what we're talking about in terms of assessment, which is really to increase the quality of our programs. And all of us are here, especially in forums like this at the PAEA, where we are interested in improving the quality. And so sometimes we think about, or we think that what we're doing is really judging the quality of our program, and we can leave that to other people. But from our perspective, we're all doing a great job, but how do we make it better? There's always ways to make it better. You know, I'm sure you have friends who look at you and say, well, you're in education, it must be great because you know what you're teaching, and every year you teach the same thing, right? Or your colleagues in other departments in the university who may not be in professional programs that don't have to do the amount of things that you do. And assessment is such a huge part of that.
So, as good educators do, we'll provide you with some key points, perhaps some take-home messages. The first being the fact that for us, we wanted to make sure that our faculty body was involved in the program assessment process, all the way from admissions through postgraduate data that we were collecting and analyzing. We felt that was important both because obviously we value the input of all of our faculty members and the experience of our faculty members, but we also felt it was important to have faculty buy into this process so that it would work the way it's intended to work as a continuous and robust process. We also felt it was important that we defined our drivers. What things were influencing our program assessment process? Why were we collecting certain pieces of data? Why were we analyzing that data in the way that we were? And as we went through that, as you'll see in a few minutes, we were able to identify some things that were playing a very prominent role in our self-assessment process and some things that were maybe playing a secondary role that we thought maybe should play a more primary role. As we started this, we had to first go back and take an inventory as to what we were already doing, and that was a very time-consuming and difficult process. We had to really make an assessment of everything we were doing before so that we had a snapshot of where we were and where we wanted to go. So we took an inventory of what we were doing and we analyzed that process so that we could move forward in a way that best suited our program. Of course, this is a dynamic and ongoing process, and we had to ensure that as we move forward, the process we put in place was able to adapt to changing demands, changing accreditation standards, to the general healthcare environment as that continues to change as well. We also wanted to make sure that there was a mechanism in place to assess the assessment. We wanted to have something in place where we could step back and take a mile-high view of the entire program assessment process. Sometimes it's easy to get caught in the weeds where you're looking at certain data collection instruments, you're really focused on analyzing data, and there isn't necessarily someone who is stepping back and looking at the process as a whole from a global perspective. And we wanted to ensure that we had that in place. And lastly, once we did have that in place, we wanted to map it all out, to create a roadmap, so to speak, so that we could ensure continuity of this process as we move forward and to make sure it continues to be as effective as we hope it will be. So, an outline of our session today. First, we're going to describe some of the problems and challenges that we faced as we embarked on this journey. We'll discuss our solution, which is the formation of our program assessment committee and what that committee's charge was and how it functions. We'll describe the process, and again, not necessarily talking too much about the details of the assessment process itself in terms of data collection and analysis, but more taking a global perspective and looking at the assessment process as a whole from that bird's eye view, and then a short discussion at the end about where we hope to go from here.
So let's first talk about the problem, or our problem, or what we wanted to improve. We recognized, like I'm sure many of you, that we didn't have an issue with collecting data. We were collecting mountains of data. In fact, we didn't realize how much data we were collecting until we started to assemble it in one place. So there was no issue with the volume. Really, the problem for us was doing a systematic analysis. And although we had volumes of data, we knew we were also looking at it, but we were realizing that it could be more systematic, that there was a way that we could organize it, organizing the process to help us see areas that maybe were not rising to the top. You know, we knew what we knew, we know what we don't know, but we didn't know what we didn't know, and sort of that was what we wanted to make sure we were doing, if that makes any sense. So again, the systematic analysis was the concern, and part of that systematic analysis with that data is allowing you the opportunity to do an aggregate analysis, which really needed improvement. And so I have two examples to share with you. we have our students complete a professionalism evaluation form multiple times throughout the program. And really that's an instrument set up or designed to foster a conversation between the student and their faculty advisor on issues everything from attendance to class participation, all those things that are hard to figure out because they're outside a traditional evaluation. What happens with that is it starts the conversation between the advisor and the student, but then after that, we didn't have the ability to aggregate that data and look at it in terms of a class and see how the class was evaluating themselves or how the faculty advisors were evaluating the students. So if we were able to put it into a format that allowed us to extract the data, that would be much more helpful. Also, we had lots of data in terms of scores on post-rotation exams. So every Friday, we have a cohort of students who are in taking exams. The faculty grade those. The scores get distributed. But we didn't have a real centralized location in a format that would allow us to tease out information that might be helpful. So for example, if we wanted to be able to see how students were performing on a surgical rotation who attend a particular site, we didn't have the ability to do that very easily. And so we thought about, in our process, how we could make that easier. We also need to consider how that data was being utilized and reported. For our SCIPEs, Supervised Clinical Practice Experiences, for those of you getting used to the newer acronym for our clinical rotations, students were completing the evaluations of the clinical sites, and those were being collected. Compounding our issue or our problem was the fact that we had started this on paper for many years. We moved to one system. We weren't happy with how that system was working. We had to move to another system. And so we had challenges with maintaining and utilizing that data. Plus, we also knew we wanted to revise that instrument. So we were trying to think about when it would be most appropriate to initiate a new instrument. We also realized that although we were doing course and instructor evaluations and rotation preceptor evaluations on one instrument, we needed to be able to have that data aggregated in a way that we could tease out parts of that. So we could definitely talk and review how courses were being evaluated separate from the individual instructor that was participating in that course. And so we sort of always go back and forth between the nitty-gritty and the theoretical, oftentimes. The other thing we realized is that it's easy to rely more on experience than data. Not that you're ever excluding data, but having lots of data and being aware of it also helps with your experience. So we were trying to figure out a way to make sure that the decisions we were making based on experience were also data-driven. Our instruments were oftentimes also driving us because we had some forms that we utilized for a long time. And so we were trying to extract data based on those instruments and then realizing, wait a second, maybe we can revise those because they might not be giving us the information that we really need or that we really care about. In particular, because the need for data changes over time in terms of who needs what from the program. Which leads to the next point, is that we have to be responsive to those needs. And most of us understand that the ARC does require a little bit of self-assessment, and certainly that is a hammer for most of us in order to get that done. But certainly there are demands outside of the ARC. And so if you're a program director, program leader, and you're completing reports, whether it's for your university, for your institution, or other, you need to have access to some data to help with collecting those reports. And that was another issue for us. Also being responsive to the market, whether it's the clinical job market or something else. We also recognized that when we started thinking about this, we became overwhelmed thinking, how are we going to do this? We don't have enough faculty to do this. If all of the faculty could do this full-time, a self-assessment process, right? I don't know if any of you have suffered through that thinking, what do we do? You know? So programs have assessment individuals who collect that data and analyze it, which certainly is helpful, and we've thought about that. But what we also realized is that we were experts in education, so we could drive the process in terms of figuring out what it was we wanted. And we are still thinking about whether we'll have somebody external to help us with actually the nitty-gritty of the data. Another problem we had was in regard to benchmarks. All of us like to have benchmarks to make it easy to do our analysis, right? And so an example of a benchmark that is easy to identify is PANCE data, because we get that. It's very clear what it is. But what type of data is out there in terms of something like deceleration from other programs? And so that became a challenge for us to think about, as a program, what was the benchmark we wanted to set so that we could identify when we were not meeting our benchmark. I mean, clearly we all understand we'd love to have no deceleration, but we recognize that that's not realistic. So you're oftentimes with benchmarks sort of looking at a realistic view and then combining that with maybe some aspirational thoughts. Ryan also was playing around and come up with a Venn diagram to sort of explain what our process was. And so the use of these circles is not to represent the fact that they are all equally weighted. It was just to give you some sort of visual that, yes, we were data-driven in terms of our program assessment, but experience was playing a large role, as was intuition. You know, with our program director, Jill, has been around for a couple of years, over 30, so has some experience and intuition and data. And we also realized that sometimes with program assessment and improvement, you're basing it on crisis management, and maybe crisis might be a strong word. But there are issues that arise in the program that you may not have the opportunity, or you may not want to wait until you have longitudinal data to make a decision. And so sometimes you need to react quickly to change something that could be problematic. We also realized that it was important to avoid the one-way street. We all understand now the importance of outcomes in our mission statement and ensuring that what we're doing is supporting our mission statement and meeting our outcomes. But sometimes we find ourselves looking at, for example, if we consider ourselves a primary care program, wow, a lot of our graduates are not going into primary care, so what do? Do we change our mission statement because that's what the graduates are doing? And there should be an element of that, but we should also step back and look in the other direction to say, wait a second, what is it that we believe, what are our core values, what's our mission, and continue to assess and revise the program to help meet that. So that's why we say avoid the one-way street, because you should be looking in both directions. And then finally, when we had our data together during this process, this schematic was developed, and basically what this is looking at the different instruments or data measures that we had here and here, and then following the curriculum all the way through. What these yellow, blue, and other colors represent of which individuals at the program were working with that data. So it helped us sort of step back and assess what we were doing, and then also realize that we needed to make some changes. So in no way was this put up here to tell you this is what you should do. This was sort of this process we went through to get to where we needed to get.
So as you saw from that last table, and as we've said a couple of times already, we were collecting lots of data, we were analyzing that data, but we wanted to make improvements, and we wanted to make improvements in terms of creating a more systematic process. We wanted to make the process a bit more robust, and we wanted to make some revisions in terms of the primary drivers of that process. Given the amount of data we were collecting, we felt this was more than any one faculty member could shoulder. And as Matt said, and certainly some of you may have outside or external folks involved in this process, whether they be consultants or data analysts or someone like that, we decided to utilize our core faculty members along with a cohort of other folks who I'll describe in a minute to form the Program Assessment Committee. And we felt that a committee was, in terms of our program's needs, the best way to approach this problem so that we could have multiple perspectives weighing in and that we could equally distribute the workload to make it a little bit less overwhelming. So we formed the Program Assessment Committee, and simply stated, this committee was formed to evaluate our program assessment process, to make recommendations for the revision and improvement of that process, and continue to provide oversight of the process moving forward to ensure continuity and to ensure efficacy so that the process was doing what it was intended to do. The committee is composed in our program of 6 core faculty members, including our program director, our medical director, our associate director, myself, and a few others. In addition, we also have an outside faculty member from someone from a program within the institution. So we have someone from the Institute of Complementary and Alternative Medicine on the committee. We have a graduate of our program on the committee who's also serving as a clinical preceptor for us. And we have a student on the committee, a current student. So we have multiple perspectives who each have been very valuable in terms of their input, in terms of their insight into the process, from everything from a student's perspective to a faculty member from another program's perspective. Initially, because of the volume of work that the committee had to do, we met fairly regularly, at least on a monthly basis over the first 6 months to a year, with a lot of work in between those meetings as well. We, again, were taking an inventory of what we were currently doing and try to define all of the data we were collecting and how we were analyzing it. As time went on and we started to accomplish some of that work and we became more comfortable with the process, we didn't meet as frequently, and now I would say we meet probably quarterly and as needed in between. In addition, as Matt mentioned, we have gone through several versions of course management software, clinical logging software, data collection instruments, and things like that. And having a committee that has the ability to step back and provide some oversight did allow us to have some continuity as we changed through different iterations of the way that we collect data. And that was a very important part of our process as well. So, certainly, as Matt was discussing, experience and intuition do play a role, not only in how we collect and analyze data, but how we make decisions as a program. Crisis management, we cannot always have data to address every problem, and sometimes unforeseen circumstances develop, and we need to have a way to quickly respond to those circumstances without having to think about, well, geez, how much data supports these decisions as we go forward. And I sort of compare it to having evidence-based medicine, and then someone walks into the emergency department with something you've never seen before. There is no evidence for this, and we have to act quickly. But we also wanted to step back and take a look at our mission. So, does our current self-assessment process follow what our mission says the goals and objectives of our program is, those program-defined objectives? How do our learning outcomes come into play? So the things that we want our students to accomplish, are we adequately measuring those things as part of our assessment process? Are we addressing the ARC standards as they exist and as they change? And what role is the general healthcare environment playing in our assessment process? With the implementation of the Affordable Care Act and some other provisions, how are we responding to that as a program? And our assessment process should reflect that. So, in order to make this a little bit easier to digest, we decided to break it down into 5 steps. First, as I mentioned, we reviewed the current process, so we took an inventory of what we were already doing, and at one point we had hundreds or thousands of pages worth of data, and we had to decide where to go from here. We then categorized that data to make it easier to digest. We eventually got down into the nitty-gritty and started to revise our data collection instruments. We wanted to know, what do we want to collect and how do we want to analyze it? And in order to do that, not only did we have to identify those drivers, but we then had to go into the data collection instruments themselves, the surveys and everything else that we make our students do, and really ask, what do we want to know? What questions are we asking? Of those thousands of pages of data, how much of it is really useful to us? We then had to assign responsibilities. So not only do we have to know what we want to know, but who's going to be responsible for it? And lastly, as we'll show, fill in the details, the who, what, when, where, why, and how, creating that roadmap, as we previously discussed. We started by reviewing the current process, and we developed a comprehensive spreadsheet using Excel, very quick and dirty, to define the current collection and analysis process, and in general, what were we collecting and who was responsible for collecting it. We had to know where we were in order to know where we wanted to go. Then we categorized the data, again, to make it easier to digest and easier to work with into the categories you see here: administrative, admissions, didactic, clinical, postgrad, and then the catch-all other for the things that didn't fit into the other categories. So this is just one example of some of the early data collection instruments that we put into one of these spreadsheets. This is not comprehensive. This is just meant to give you some idea of where we started as we went through this journey. I know it might be difficult to read, but in that left-hand column are the data measures, the tools themselves, who's responsible for collecting it, who's responsible for analyzing it, and then we also included a link to the data collection instrument itself so that as we were having these meetings, we could easily go in and look at the form and see if it was asking the questions that we wanted answered. Here's another example dealing with admission data points, and we went through and did this for every piece of data that we collect as a program. It was work, it took some time. And as we went forward, it became a little bit easier to wrap our heads around what we were already doing. Go ahead, Matt.
Okay. I was enjoying the music. So further along the process, as Ryan mentioned, now we had assembled all of this data. And I might point out that if we're making this look like this was a very smooth process, it wasn't always that way.
We initially, when the Program Assessment Committee started to meet, there were some differences of opinion as to where we should start because we had this monumental task in front of us. And some members of the committee did want to start by taking that step back, having that bird's eye view, and taking a more global approach to the process, while other members of the committee really wanted to dive right in to those details and started to revise the instruments and work sort of upwards from there. So it took several meetings until we could even decide how we wanted to start. And once we got there, then things started to roll very nicely.
Absolutely, and we got to the endpoint that we were looking. So once we had collected all of these data instruments, then it was time to revise some of them as necessary, now that we were all coming from the same perspective in terms of the lenses we should be looking through when revision is occurring. Again, using some of those considerations like mission statement, outcomes, standards, the healthcare environment, et cetera. So one example here within our mission statement is we have as a mission to educate PAs to practice humanistic care. And many of our applicants will talk about that in their application. To meet that, one element of our education that meets that is a threaded humanities curriculum through the 3 years. And so what we then realized is what kind of outcomes were we looking at, or what questions were we asking to see if we were meeting that. And so on our alumni survey, we have the opportunity now to ask those kinds of questions. But we also realized that could be asked in other instruments as well. So this was just one example of how that works. And once you have that outcome, you can see how you're meeting your mission statement or not and adjust the curriculum as necessary. Makes it seem so simple, right? But we know that it's not. This was, we thought it was worth taking a photograph of this. This happened to be a panoramic picture with my iPhone, and that's why it looks a little funny. But Ryan and I were sitting one afternoon, and we had already revised the clinical evaluation instruments already. And then we sat down again, and we looked at them, and we said, oh, this is not what we want. We thought we had perfected it. And so we were busy on the paper trying to change things and move them around and work with what we had. And finally we said, this is nuts. Let's just go to a classroom. Let's just throw things on the chalkboard to sort of brainstorm what should be there. So as we were doing that on one late afternoon, then Jill walked over and said, what are you guys doing? And now she joined our process. But it was not only the two of us brainstorming with Jill. Once we had come up with something that made sense, we realized that other people needed to look at these instruments as well. So we brought it to our leadership group within the program. We brought it to the assessment committee to look at. We even beta tested it with a class of clinical students to fill it out and see if it made sense to them, what we were asking. So you can see that despite throwing a lot of ideas down, we crossed a lot off because some of it was data we were asking in the past that it may matter, but there may be different ways of getting that data rather than using it in the evaluation instrument. Because the other challenge we face, as all of you do, is trying to ask enough questions to get the information you want without asking too many questions, which frustrates the students to have to do more evaluations. And I'm sure like you, we do a lot of them. And so sometimes too many questions is not helpful. So here's an example of the previous evaluation instrument. It's in a Word document here, but it's on our clinical management system. And so we had two parts to the old one. This was sort of an evaluation the student filled out on the site, and it started with things like, let me move my cursor over here, like demographics in terms of when does a student report, and how often did you observe versus participate in the care? What type of activities did you participate in? Morning report, call, et cetera. And then, of course, some open-ended questions, strengths and weaknesses. Whoops. So we recognize that some of these things are absolutely important, but maybe we could get that data other ways, from faculty doing site visits. And that would be an easier way. And let's use the instrument to reflect what we want. Then there was the second part, which was a student self-assessment that they complete at the end of each rotation. How did they feel their basic science prepared them, and how did they feel at the end? And we recognized that was important to know, but maybe there was a better way of doing that, to have students assess their skills before rotations and then at the end of rotations, rather than with each one, because all the specialties are different. So we decided to take that out of here. And when we sat down and went through it, we came up with something, again, a little challenging to read, but was divided into two sections. The first part having more to do with questions about the preceptor here, and then this side, more questions in regards to the site, asking about, did I have a proper orientation? Was I provided effective feedback from my preceptors? Did the rotation meet the objectives that were expected? And also a question about the clerkship provided me with an opportunity to develop my skills providing humanistic care. It was one question we thought was important to ask, which we were not doing. And so that was where we ended up.
So at this point, we had taken an inventory of what we were already doing, and we had revised instruments to better address those things that we thought should be driving our program assessment process. And now it came time to begin to define this a little bit more clearly. So once we had the instruments in place and we knew what we wanted to do, we had to start to assign responsibilities. Who was going to be responsible for what and when? And again, given that this was a faculty-driven process for us, there are parts of the data collection and analysis that would fall under the purview of the program director, the associate director, the medical director, certainly the assistant director of didactic education and or clinical education, but also the committee chairs. And the committee chairs who have been most involved in this process for us were the chairs of the curriculum committee and the chair of the admissions committee and our admissions coordinator as we went through. And what's equally as important as assigning responsibilities is ensuring that there's adequate communication between these folks. So we didn't want people to be working in silos. We didn't want one person to be responsible for collecting this set of data and analyzing it, but then not expressing their analysis of that data in an open forum. So again, we did continue to have meetings of the Program Assessment Committee, and we also have meetings with the faculty body so that this information can be clearly disseminated among everyone involved. So to go back to this, this table that Matt had described previously, this is how the things used to look. And as you can see, this isn't the easiest table to read. It's a little bit confusing. The color coding, who's responsible for what and when, but this wasn't quite adequate enough for our purposes. It didn't adequately define what we wanted to do. So we had to fill in the details. We had to really clarify this and create that roadmap that we had talked about before. And it was around this time that I attended the PANDO workshop on program evaluation provided by PAEA, and it really helped to clarify a lot of the questions that we were asking. And it was also great to talk with other folks who were going through this in other programs to get their perspective and to hear some of their trials and tribulations. And it really brought things full circle. And that's the time where we started to realize filling in these details was important so that we could create that roadmap and ensure this chain of custody. And we felt this was particularly important. So as data is collected, then define not only who's going to collect it, but where that data is going to live and who has access to it, who's going to be responsible for analyzing that data, and how frequently does that need to happen? Who's going to disseminate that data, and when is that going to happen? How is the data used? Are we using it to address, to evaluate our mission statement? Are we using it to evaluate our curriculum or our admissions criteria? And then ultimately, who's responsible for closing that loop and making sure that as decisions are made as a result of that analysis, that we continue to evaluate the process and make sure that those decisions are being evaluated as we move forward. So, this is a table that was created by Tony Miller, and he disseminated this table at that Pando workshop. And this was the table that really brought it all full circle for us. As you can see across the top in the columns, it lists the evaluation instrument or data source, who completes the instrument and how frequently, against what benchmark is that data being compared, what data is actually being collected in that instrument, where will the results live and how are they disseminated? How are the results being used, and then what type of measure is that? We took this table, again, which we found very useful, and we adapted it for our own purposes. So we changed it around a little bit, and we started to fill in the blanks. So we kept most of the columns across the top, but we also added in who does the analysis and the method of data collection. And this really helped us start to define the process, to create that roadmap that I was talking about. So here's a sampling of the data we collect in the clinical aspect of our program. And just to give you one example, the third row down, post-rotation exam grades. And we just went through and said that on at least an annual basis, our staff will compile those grades. Of course, the exams are being graded every Friday when the students take them, but we need a way of aggregating that data so that we can compare year to year over time on a longitudinal axis. So at least on an annual basis, we're going to have our staff compile that data. We set a benchmark for ourselves. We had to go back and look at historical data within our own program and decide what type of benchmark worked best for us. So we did that. The data collected, student clinical knowledge, and where's that data going to be stored? So we're going to store it in a centralized location that can be easily accessed by anyone who needs to access it, rather than having it live in someone's file cabinet or on someone's computer where you have to go searching for it if you need it. Who does the analysis? We decided that the curriculum committee, in consultation with the assistant director for clinical education and the program director, at least on an annual basis, is going to look at this data and analyze it and determine whether decisions need to be made on it. Okay? Now, what's important here is that regardless of whether we meet our benchmark, that analysis is taking place. And we've now defined that. And we've defined how frequently that needs to happen. Because sometimes you don't meet your benchmark, things go wrong, and we have to make some changes. But you also want to know, if you are meeting your benchmark, why? What's working? What part of that is working so that you can continue to do those things and enhance your process? The results are used just very broadly to review our curriculum and our rotations. And the method of data collection, as I said before, these PREs, these post-rotation exams, are graded by our faculty members once the students take the exams on Friday. We, again, went through and did this for every piece of data that we collect. And now we have our roadmap. We know exactly who's completing the instrument. We know who's compiling the data. We know where that data lives. We know who's analyzing the data. We know what type of data is being collected and how that data is being used. And we know how frequently all this is happening. All right? And at this point, we really started to be able to wrap our heads around our program assessment process. We have this roadmap. We have the chain of custody for data. And it's going to help us move forward and ensure that this happens on a continuous, ongoing basis, that we can adapt this. This is a living document. This is flexible, and this can change over time, and this will change over time as we have to adapt.
So as Ryan mentioned, now that we had the process in place, one of the important parts was to make sure that it was getting done. And so it was important to ensure that the process was implemented. And so it was critical for us to identify who's sort of watching the process, you know. And that has become, it's not a challenge. We had to figure that out. Would this be the assessment committee? Would this be the leadership of the program, et cetera? Because clearly it's great to have a nice process, but if you're not utilizing it, we don't just want it to live somewhere on the computer hard drive and never be accessed at all. Ryan also mentioned that continuous revision is necessary. We happen to be very fortunate that we were able to be one of those programs that submitted our self-study report 2 years prior to our visit. So we felt committed, should be committed after that. We received that feedback, and that feedback allowed us to then look at our process and see whether there were holes, whether there were revisions that need to be made. And absolutely, that's what has occurred as we received that feedback and appreciated all that was shared with us. Although we are, again, as we said, not experts in self-assessment, Ryan indicated all the information he gained from attending the workshop, and we certainly wanted to give a plug for the Pando workshop for those of you who may be interested, and it will happen to be in in Fort Worth, Texas, in March. Highly recommend that someone from the program attend this. We also were talking about some of the things that people might have been looking for when coming to this session, and we recognize that analysis for many programs is sort of a challenge about what to do with analysis, or how do you do it. So although that wasn't part of our goal here, that was part of that workshop, and Ryan was showing me the information they went over at that workshop, and so we were already brainstorming about developing something to submit next year to see if it's any help, even helping ourselves, clearly. So attend that workshop if you can. Again, as all good educators do, we told you what we were going to tell you, we told you, and now we're reminding you again that this is something that all faculty can be involved in. In fact, faculty should be involved in this, right? One of the standards does require principal faculty involvement in the self-assessment process. It doesn't require that everyone be involved, but for the most part, most program faculty are involved to different degrees based on their assignments in the program. Know your drivers. Think about that. What really are the drivers of your self-assessment process? Take an inventory. You know, we just talked to another colleague who came in earlier, said, I have all this data, I don't know what to do with it. It's certainly important to step back and look at all the evaluation instruments you have, look at that and see where there might be some holes. Then recognize that it's dynamic, it's ongoing. Once it's finalized, it's not finalized. It gets finalized again. And that it's important to step back and have somebody assess the assessment to make sure it does make sense. And map out the process. Fill in the details, or as we talked about, follow the chain of custody with all of your data points from beginning to end through the loop. Some references we have up here for you, if you find that those might be helpful. A little thing called the ARC manual, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And there you are. So any questions we can answer for you? Yes? Well, yeah, and that's probably something also to get some additional training and understanding of. So that was a specific thing that happened to us. One of our issues, as we mentioned, was converting from one system to another. And so we lost some of our quantitative data from one system to another, but we had lots of qualitative data in terms of strengths and weaknesses from rotations. So we were able to report those, but what we didn't do, which we should have done, is indicate the number of times those types of statements were being made, a strength or a weakness. So that is one way to use the qualitative data, which is absolutely fine to include that. Also, a reason why we continue to allow our instruments to get that type of information, because we feel it's important to have a balance of both. So I don't know if that helps answer your question. Yeah.
That was my question as well.
Oh, was yours? Okay.
With the comments that the students make about specific sites, and if they're repetitive, like continuous negative comments about a site, particularly, how do you extrapolate that data? For that, it's very labor intensive to have to repeat every single one of those, and how do you measure that?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a benchmark for repeating negative comments or in your system?
Do you want to answer, or do you want me to?
Go ahead.
It's hard to determine. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, how do you deal with all of the comments in terms of the qualitative data, in terms of setting benchmarks to know what to address? I think the challenge is that you can't always set benchmarks for every item because you'll get comments that you weren't thinking about. Really, the benchmarks, in my opinion, have to do with setting the goals that you expect to achieve and whether that's happening. Those other comments are sort of supportive data. And what you do is you indicate how frequently that occurs. And so not only does that get fed back into your process when you're doing your analysis of the quantitative and qualitative data, but then that also is being fed back, if it's about a site, to the faculty members or whoever is visiting that site to bring that to the individuals and talk about it and see what kind of resolution there may be. Does that help?
Yeah. And so what we often do is we'll have a data collection instrument that has both quantitative and qualitative data on it, and the benchmarks we'll set will really primarily be for the quantitative data, with, as Matt said, the qualitative data playing a supporting role.
Sir.
So 2 questions. I guess the easy one is, how many principal faculty do you have, and what percentage of them serve on the committee? And then the second one, Ryan, for you, is you had mentioned briefly in passing that you had examined some commercial products that help do this, and I just wanted to see if you could kind of maybe expand on that a little more in terms of what your opinions were on some of those products that were available.
15 FTEs? What's our? I think we're about.
FTEs about 13.
Yeah, we're about 13 FTEs, several part-time faculty, but 13 FTEs. You might think also, well, that's a lot of faculty. We're also a 3-year program, 50 students per year. We also have a teaching load of 30 credits a year. That is mandated by our university, with some opportunity for release down to 24 if you're working on scholarly activity. So we have heavy workloads, which is why we wanted to recognize the fact that many of you are saying, how do you have time to do it? And that was definitely a frustrating point for us of how do we get there. And so after we all hemmed and hawed about how it's going to happen, we just started to make it happen and eventually came through. So that's your first question was, how do we do that? And then the second
And we
one.
do have, so we have, of those 13 FTEs, we have 6 faculty members who sit on the committee, in addition to the outside folks that we talked about. So.
And that's on the assessment committee itself, but
Right.
all faculty are involved in other committees that are also participating in analyzing data that they're responsible for. So everybody's got a hand in it in some way, shape, or form.
Right. In terms of software and other programs and things like that, our program at some point collecting data via paper, and we graduated to Excel, and that worked for a while, and then we continued to go through different iterations of data collection and course management programs. What we felt was important, there were times when we were trying to fit our process into the program. And we had a program, and we weren't happy with it, and we tried, and it just wasn't working for us. And many of you may have had similar experiences. And so we took a step back and said, wait a minute, why don't we find a program that works for us, that fits our needs? And so we're actually currently with perhaps a lesser-known program, piece of software, but really it had the ability for us to start at ground zero and build up and make it what we need it to be, so that we could adapt the program to fit our needs rather than trying to fit into a box that we didn't fit in. So.
Yes, I think we got our 3-minute signal, so we'll see if we take 1 or 2 questions.
So now that you guys have gone through this whole process from beginning to end, maybe what types of data would you suggest starting with, or maybe that you had wished that you had started with targeting first? Assuming a vast amount of data, where would you have started?
I think, go ahead.
Yeah, where we did start was with clinical data, with data involving evaluation of rotations and things like that, and that's the example that we had put up on the screen. And we started there, number one, because it was easy to start there. There were some benchmarks that we could work with, and we also felt that those were the instruments that were most in need of revision at that time. So we decided that was a nice place to start.
For you, I would say start with what you feel like you have the least best handle on. So it could vary from program to program. For us, we did so many evaluations. We had lots of good data collection in our didactic part of the program, but the clinical data was being collected, but not to the degree that we would have liked, and that's why we focused there. So for you, I would say really think about what information is more problematic for you, if there is one. And are we okay? One more question? Okay.
How did you build your instruments and know that they were valid?
That's always a problem. I mean, and so why we did our best with beta testing with one student to do that. And I think that's going to be something we're going to determine over time, but not something we specifically focused on.
Yeah. there
One more
more?
question.
Have you worked with them on how to evaluate the nutrition? Where, sometimes at the end of one or two, how do you analyze such a paucity of data? That's what we're always struggling with.
So if your question is about analyzing the data, which is what we were alluding to before, that's sort of a difficult thing to give a quick answer to. And I guess maybe the quick answer we could give as we were brainstorming about that is think about the fact that when you have that data, what's your differential diagnosis for those results? Really, and once we said that to each other, we thought, that makes sense. What's the most likely cause? What's the most serious cause that we're concerned about? And everything in between. You sort of do a brainstorm. And then look at that data and see what most likely makes sense. Follow it through with your mission statement of what changes need to be made and go in that direction. So differential, I think, if you put that in your head, might be helpful.
And again, to back up Matt's point from earlier, we felt it was important to set realistic benchmarks. So ideally, there would be zero attrition, but that's not realistic. And so ensure that whatever benchmark you do set, if you don't meet it, that means we're going to have to do something about it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.